For 2 seasons, I treated a corner of my test bed as a dead zone. Compacted clay, no worms, nothing would grow. Then I poured one batch of a mix that cost me about $1 to make. 3 days later, I dug in, and the soil was alive again, crumbly, dark, and the worms I assumed had left were everywhere. I have the records. The synthetic fertilizer industry built a $100 billion business on the idea that you have to keep buying inputs forever. This pour says otherwise, which is exactly why you won't hear it from the people selling the bags. Stay with me to the end, because there's one cheap ingredient I add to this mix every fall that makes the worms multiply about twice as fast. Let me name who I'm talking about, because vague villains help nobody. I'm talking about the synthetic fertilizer industry. After 1945, the plants that had been making ammonium nitrate for explosives had nothing to blow up anymore. So they converted, same nitrogen chemistry, new product. They started packing it into bags and selling it to farmers and eventually to people like you and me. And through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the USDA and the land grant extension offices shifted their recommendations right along with it. Soluble NPK became the standard advice: fast, measurable, easy to sell. Here is the anchor, and you can go look this up. I have a 1943 USDA Victory Garden Bulletin, wartime before the conversion, and in it there's a description of a compost and manure tea you brewed to revive tired soil, a biological method, cheap, repeatable, built around feeding the life already in the ground. I tested a version of it in my own test bed, and I'll get to what I found, but here's the part that matters. That kind of advice quietly vanished from the extension literature once synthetic fertilizer became the official recommendation. It didn't get disproven. It got dropped. And I want to be honest with you about why I'm telling you this. I'm not a conspiracy man. I found the bulletin, I read it, I ran the comparison in my own dirt and wrote down the numbers. That's the whole basis for what I'm about to show you. The stakes are simple and they're personal. Soluble nitrogen washes out. So you buy a bag every single spring, and the next spring you buy it again. Because the method was never designed to build soil that holds itself together. The biological approach was: one rebuilds fertility you keep. The other rents it to you by the season. And while you're renting, the worms leave and the structure collapses, which brings me back to that dead corner of my own test bed. That corner sat at the north end of the test bed for 2 full seasons doing absolutely nothing. Compacted clay packed hard enough that my trowel bounced off it. I'd dig a shovelful and count 0 worms. 0, not 1. Dry, grey, lifeless dirt. And I'd been treating it as a write-off, a place I'd given up on. So I decided to run it as an experiment instead of a graveyard. One pour, one batch of something that cost me about $1 to make. Let me walk you through exactly what's in it, because there's no mystery here and there's no proprietary anything. That's the whole point. Here's the mix: about 5 gallons of water, 2 heaping cups of my own finished compost straight out of the curing bin. And if you've got worm castings, those work even better, but the compost from your own pile is fine. Then 2 tablespoons of unsulfured molasses. That's it. 3 ingredients: water, compost, molasses. Then I put a cheap aquarium air pump in the bucket, the kind that costs you $8 or $10 at any pet store and lasts for years. And I let the whole thing bubble for 24 hours. Let me do the cost breakdown for you, because the dollar figure matters. And I want you to see it's real. The water is free. It comes out of my hose. The compost is free. I made it from kitchen scraps and leaves I'd have thrown out anyway. The molasses is the only thing I actually buy. And 2 tablespoons out of a jar that costs $3 or $4 works out to pennies. Pennies. So the batch runs me about $1. And honestly, that's me rounding up to account for the electricity the air pump pulls overnight. This is the kind of thing that never made it into a glossy bag with a price tag, and I think you can already see why. Now, 24 hours later, I had 5 gallons of what looked like weak coffee. Smelled faintly sweet and earthy, and that smell matters. I'll come back to it. I poured the whole batch slow across that dead corner, let it soak in, and walked away. 3 days. That's all I gave it before I went back with my trowel and dug in, and the soil that had been grey and hard and dead was dark. It was crumbly. It broke apart in my hand instead of sitting there in a fused clod. And the worms, The worms I'd been telling myself had abandoned that corner years ago, they were right there near the surface. I'll give you the exact numbers a little later, because I counted them and wrote them down, the same way I write everything down. This is the part the people selling you the bags would just as soon you never tried, because once you've seen 5 gallons of pennies do this, the annual trip to the garden centre starts to look a little different. All right, let us keep going, because the recipe is only half of it. The recipe is the easy half, the part that actually matters, the part that tells you why this couldn't be killed off, no matter how hard the recommendations shifted away from it, is the mechanism. Here is the science. That molasses isn't fertilizer. I want to be clear about that because people see sugar and assume you're feeding the plant. You're not. You're feeding the bacteria. Your soil, even soil you think is dead, is full of dormant bacteria. They're sitting there in the dry clay, shut down, waiting. They're alive, but they're idling because they've got no food and no water to get going. When you pour 5 gallons of sugar water on them, you've just rung the dinner bell. The molasses is a simple carbohydrate, an easy energy source, and those bacteria wake up and start eating. And when bacteria eat, they reproduce fast. Within 48 to 72 hours, you've gone from a sleepy, starved population to a full-on bloom, billions of them per teaspoon of soil, all multiplying at once. That's your 3-day window right there. That's not magic. That's just a population responding to food and moisture the way any population does. Now, here is the part that surprised me the first time I read the chemistry on it, and it's the part that explains the crumbly soil. When those bacteria are active and feeding, they excrete a kind of sticky secretion. The technical term is extracellular polysaccharides, but all you need to know is it's a biological glue. A sugar-based glue the microbes produce as a byproduct of living. And that glue does something to clay that no fertilizer can do. Clay particles are tiny and flat, and in compacted dead soil, they pack down on top of each other like wet sheets of paper. No air, no space, no drainage. That's why my trowel bounced off it. But the bacterial glue binds those tiny particles together into bigger clusters, little crumbs, and between the crumbs you get pore space. Air gets in, water moves through, roots can push down. That crumb structure, soil scientists call it aggregation, is the entire difference between dead clay and living tilth, and you can build it in 3 days with sugar and a bucket of microbes. So think about what that means. The bag gives the plant a quick drink of soluble nitrogen and walks away, and the clay underneath stays just as compacted and dead as it was. The pore rebuilds the actual structure of the soil from the biology up. One treats the symptom for a season, the other fixes the ground. And this is exactly the kind of mechanism that got quietly written out of the extension bulletins after the war. Did not because it stopped working, but because you can't put a bacterial bloom in a bag and sell it to the same gardener every April. And that's only the bacteria, because the question I had standing over that crumbly corner with worms wriggling at my feet was the obvious one. If that soil was dead, if I'd counted 0 worms for 2 seasons, where did these worms come from in 3 days? They didn't crawl in from the neighbour's yard. The answer is they never actually left. When clay gets compacted and dries out, worms don't die and they don't pack up and move. They burrow down below the dry zone, curl into a knot, coat themselves in mucus, and go dormant. It's called estivation. Same thing they do in a drought. So for 2 seasons, I'm counting 0 worms per shovelful in that corner, and I'm writing 0 in the notebook, and the whole time they're sitting 3-4 feet down, waiting. They're not gone. They're parked. What pulls them back up is a gradient. Worms follow 2 things, moisture and food. The pore delivers both at once. The water re-wets the top 8 inches, and the bacterial bloom I just described starts respiring, which means it's giving off carbon dioxide and warming the zone by a fraction of a degree. To a dormant worm, that CO2 plume reads like a dinner bell. They climb toward it, and here's the part that surprised me even after I understood the mechanism. They move fast. 3 days. I dug that corner on the 3rd morning and counted between 8 and 12 worms per shovelful. From 0. I went back to the notebook and checked the dead zone entries from the 2 prior seasons just to be sure I wasn't fooling myself. 0, 0, 0, 0, then 8 to 12. The records don't lie, and it wasn't just the worms. I run a pH meter on that bed, calibrated weekly, and the dead corner had been sitting at my native clay baseline of about 5.4, sour, tight, locked up. 3 days after the pour, it had nudged toward 6.2. Now, I won't pretend a single pour permanently fixed my pH. What's happening is the microbial activity and the worm castings are buffering the top layer, moving it toward neutral, right where the roots feed. The soil went from that grey, dense, packed clay to something dark and crumbly. You could close your fist around and have it fall apart. 3 days, $1. Meanwhile, my neighbour, different fellow, not Carol, was still out there every few weeks, shaking a bag of soluble fertilizer onto soil just as compacted and lifeless as my corner used to be. He gets a green flush for a couple of weeks, then it fades, then he buys another bag. The plants look fed. The ground stays dead. Now, here is where most people get this wrong. And this is the part the bag sellers would never bother teaching you because it costs them nothing and earns them nothing. First, your water. If you're on municipal water like most folks, it's chlorinated, and chlorine is in there specifically to kill microbes. Pour that straight into your brew, and you've sterilized the very thing you're trying to grow. So I let my 5 gallons sit out uncovered for 24 hours, or I run the air pump in it for an hour first. The chlorine gas is off. Free. You just have to wait. Second, soil temperature. I check it with my digital thermometer before every pour, same as I do before planting. Below about 55 degrees, the bacteria barely wake up and the worms stay parked. Pour into cold spring clay, and you'll swear it didn't work, when really the soil was just too cold to respond. I wait for the soil to come up to temperature. Third, and this is the one that can actually do harm, keep the brew aerobic. That air pump isn't optional. The whole point is to grow the good bacteria, the ones that need oxygen. Let the brew sit without air for a day or two, and it goes anaerobic. It sours, it stinks like rotten eggs, and now you're growing the organisms that produce alcohol and hydrogen sulfide. Pour that on your soil and you'll set it back, not forward. If it smells sweet and earthy, like the forest floor, it's good. If it smells bad, dump it and start over. Tested that the hard way once, confirmed, moved on. And then the punchline, the thing that turns this whole exercise on its head, you don't pour forever. That's the entire difference. Once the biology establishes, once the worms are breeding and the bacteria are building structure, and that crumb holds together on its own, the soil starts feeding itself. The castings recharge the nutrients. The structure holds the water. I poured that corner a handful of times the first season, and I have barely touched it since. The opposite of the bag, which you have to buy again every single spring for the rest of your life. This is the kind of thing that quietly stopped showing up in the extension literature, and it wasn't an accident. Now, before we keep going, I want to share something with you. If what I'm walking you through here is making sense, if you're starting to see that yield is a soil chemistry problem and not a luck problem, the full science behind this pour is laid out in my book, Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol. Chapter 3, Soil Reset, is the one that matters here. It covers pH adjustment, cation exchange capacity. That's how well your soil holds onto nutrients instead of letting them wash away. Plus compost quality and exact amendment rates with diagrams. It's the chemistry this brew exploits. It's $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're watching on your television, go ahead and grab your phone and point it at the QR code on screen. Take your time finding it. I'll be right here. If you're on your phone or laptop already, the link is right down in the description. This is for the gardener who already has beds and already grows food, but knows in their gut they're leaving half the harvest on the table. All right, let us keep going, because I want to be honest with you about why this got buried, and it comes down to dollars. The business model only works if the deficiency never goes away. Soluble nitrate, the nitrogen in that bag, is water mobile. It dissolves. The plant grabs what it can in a window of a few weeks, and the rest leaches straight down below the root zone and out of reach. It's gone, which means you have to buy it again and again, every season, forever. That's not a side effect. That is the product, a recurring revenue stream, and across the whole country. It adds up to the tens of billions of dollars a year I mentioned at the start. Now, a soil that's biologically alive does the opposite. The bacteria in the castings hold nutrients in the root zone and recycle them. The structure stops the leaching. A garden like that needs less and less from a bag every year. You can see the problem. Self-sustaining fertility is a terrible thing to sell because the better it works, the less the customer comes back. So after the war, when those munitions plants needed a peacetime market and the extension recommendations shifted towards soluble NPK, the biological methods didn't get the funding and didn't get the field day demonstrations. They just quietly fell out of the literature. Now, let me be fair, because you're skeptical, and you should be. Synthetic fertilizer works. It genuinely does. It grows food fast, it's cheap by the pound, and it helped feed a population that was growing quickly. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's poison or that nobody should ever use it. That's not honest, and it's not what I found. But here's the cost nobody put on the label: that soluble nitrogen bypasses the soil biology entirely. The plant doesn't need the bacteria to feed it, so the relationship that builds living soil never forms. Over years, the worms leave, the structure collapses into compacted clay, exactly like my dead corner. And now you're dependent. Every spring bag isn't fertility you own. It's fertility you're renting. And the rent comes due every April, while the ground underneath gets a little deader each year. That's what it cost you to never hear about $1 worth of molasses and compost. Now stay with me, because I promised you one more thing at the start: the cheap ingredient I add to this mix every fall that makes the worms multiply about twice as fast. Here it is. 1 cup of plain cornmeal, stirred into the autumn batch of the brew. That's it. Not the spring batch, not the summer batch. The fall pour, right before the ground starts cooling down. Here is the science. Cornmeal is a dense, high-energy carbohydrate, and worm breeders have used it for years to drive cocoon production. When a worm has surplus energy going into the cold, it doesn't just survive, it breeds. So when I pour that cornmeal brew into the corner in October, I'm not feeding the soil for this season, I'm setting up next season. The worms breed up before they go dormant for winter, and I walk into spring with a far denser population than I started with. I ran this in the test bed. The corner that got the cornmeal brew in the fall showed roughly double the worm count the following spring compared to the corner I left without it. Same bed, same depth, same shovelful check. Now, I want to be honest with you. This was not a perfectly controlled experiment. The two corners don't drain identically, conditions vary, and your soil might behave differently than mine. So test it yourself before you trust it across the whole bed. And one hard limit, 1 cup, not more. I tried 2 cups one fall just to see, and the extra sugar load tipped the brew anaerobic. It soured. A soured brew does the opposite of what you want, so keep it to a single cup and keep that air pump running. A cup of cornmeal, pennies from the pantry, and it roughly doubles your worm population over a winter. That is exactly the kind of cheap biological trick that never made it into the bag-selling playbook. Because there's nothing to sell you. Before I let you go, the reason I can tell you the worms came back is simple. I counted them. I wrote it down. The records don't lie. That whole discipline, what to measure, how to track it in a notebook, when to check soil temperature, is laid out in Chapter 2 of my book, The Measurement Foundation. There are diagrams in there showing exactly what to record so you can run your own dead corner comparison instead of taking my word for it. The book is 115 pages, day by day, $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're watching on the TV, go ahead and grab your phone and point it at the QR code on screen. Take your time finding it. I'll be right here. If you're on your phone or laptop already, the link is right down in the description. Now you've got the measurement side the bag seller's always left out. So that's the whole thing. $1 worth of molasses and compost, aerated overnight, wakes dead clay, and brings the worms back to the surface in 3 days. You don't have to keep renting fertility from a bag every April. Once the biology establishes, the soil starts holding its own. Your conditions might be different. Soil chemistry varies, climate varies, and your dead corner isn't my dead corner. So test it on one bad patch this season and compare it against the rest of your bed. That's how you'll know for yourself. And if you want to go deeper on suppressed soil knowledge, I've got a video coming on the wartime cover cropping method the extension officers quietly dropped for the same reason they dropped the tea. All right, that's what I have for you today. I'll see you in the next one.